Come on a journey to lost civilizations. See ancient artifacts and long-lost ancient scrolls.
The strange writing on this clay brick is known as cuneiform. Now this script...
Hear international presenter Gordon Gossett and travel with him to ancient Babylon and the island of Patmos to discover how ancient mysteries reveal the future.
I want to welcome you in the audience and those that are watching on screen to our series called Ancient Mysteries Reveal the Future. This is a series of audio-visual presentations where we look at ancient texts, we look at archaeology, we look at university history, and we see that some very ancient mysteries can reveal a very real future for us here today. In fact, these mysteries will reveal your future. Today, we're going to have a look at some more predictions from the scripture, and these ones are going to be based on something that Jesus said. Jesus himself. Now, we're going to do a couple of sessions and identify this man, Jesus Christ. But tonight, this afternoon, we're going to look at some of the predictions that he made, specific predictions about the future. So as we go to our Ancient Mysteries Reveal the Future today, I just want to recap a wee bit on yesterday's messages. Yesterday we looked at the dream of the king. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and Daniel prayed and he was given the same dream and he gave the interpretation of the dream. And for those that were here, you would know that it would be impossible for him to have predicted the future so accurately. How could he have known? How could he have known that after 4 empires, the empire wouldn't be replaced by a 5th, but it would be divided into 10? We're going to see some more amazing prophecies today that the Bible has an unerring accuracy that's impossible to have just taken a punt, to just have a guess. And we looked at the essentials for knowing the future were these 2 things: historical accuracy and a proven track record and dependable predictions. Today's program is 2 parts. We're looking at Pompeii and Masada, global warnings. Part 1 is Jerusalem and Masada, the coming of the Romans. So tighten your seatbelts. We're going to go on an amazing journey and we're going to see some interesting mysteries from history. Last night I touched on one and we're going to look at it again. The mystery of Cyrus, why Cyrus let the Jews go and why he let them rebuild the temple. The second mystery from history is to do with this man, Alexander the Great. We saw where he was predicted to come in the future in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. But we're going to see that he was predicted almost by name in another prophecy in the book of Daniel. Daniel, written in 540 BC, chapter 8. There's an amazing prophecy about this man, Alexander the Great. And the question on the screen is, why did this prophecy change his mind? What was Alexander the Great about to do? Alexander the Great had just conquered Tyre, which is a Syro-Phoenician city. And that in itself is an amazing prophecy, how he even swept the dust off the streets and threw it into the sea to fulfill a prophecy. But Alexander the Great was conquering, and he had a mantra. He would come to a town or a city or a country, and he would say, "He who is not with me is against me." He was probably the first to say that. You're either with us or you're against us. And when he was coming to Jerusalem, he gave them the ultimatum. Jerusalem was in a quandary. The reason they had their city, the reason they had their temple, the reason they existed as a nation was because of the philanthropic nature of the Persians, Cyrus, Darius and Artaxerxes. So what were they to do? They were in a quandary. On one hand, Alexander the Great with his army that was impossible to resist was telling them, you're either for us or you're for the Persians, and that would have been so perfidious to turn their back on the Persians. Do you agree? They're benefactors to side with the Greeks. And as we go through this program, I'm going to share with you an amazing mystery from history. Many historians cannot explain why Alexander the Great did not destroy Jerusalem, because they did not side with the Greeks. They had to stick with the Persians. We'll see why this prophecy changed his mind. And we're going to go back 2,000 years now to the ancient city of Jerusalem. And we're going to go to the temple, the sanctuary, Herod's temple. This temple was built by King Herod. He did an amazing building project while he was king in Israel. He built Caesarea on the seacoast. It's an amazing place. He built this aqueduct that carried water 7 kilometres to provide fresh water for the seaside resort. And I can tell you from experience that water is lovely to swim in. The moment I got near the Mediterranean, I had to get in there. He built Herodion near Bethlehem, and he built this other temple that we're going to talk about, Masada. It was a fortress where he built a palace on the cliffs of it. We'll show you a picture of his palace there. His palace is, the remnants of it is just down on the cliff face. 3-tiered palace. You see it there, we'll put a circle around it for you. He also built another fortress palace called Macarius, and that's where John the Baptist was beheaded. You may have heard of this Herod. This Herod is the one who slaughtered the infants. You remember the Christmas story of Jesus, where all the infants under 2 years old got killed? Well, this was this man Herod. This Masada had a beautiful view over the Dead Sea. He had a great view over the expansive land under his reign. This man was so cruel that Caesar Augustus said, it's better to be his pig than one of his sons, because he killed his sons. And we know the story of the murder of the infants in Bethlehem. That wasn't the only murder of infants that was promulgated by this brutal king. When he knew he was dying, he gave command to his soldiers that when he died, they were to go into a certain village and slaughter all of the children. So he knew at least somebody would be crying at his death. What a brutal man. But anyway, let's go back to the palace, the temple that he built. This first century temple, it was one of the great wonders of the ancient world. He extended Temple Mount, built a huge flat plain. It was on top of a hill. When you build a giant building on top of a hill, it gets a bit wobbly, doesn't it? You don't even need an earthquake. So what he did, he extended the hill and with this huge flat artificial plain and then built the palace there. We're going to go back there 2,000 years ago, and this is the place that Jesus regularly visited. Jesus regularly visited this amazing building. And he made this comment. He said to his disciples, do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another. Not one stone will be left upon another that shall not be thrown down. The question's why? Why did Jesus say that, do you think? What instigated him to make that statement that every stone in this building is going to be thrown down, there won't be one left upon another? I want to answer that question for you. Because if you look in the gospel stories, the gospel accounts, in Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke 21, prior to Jesus making this statement, it tells us that the disciples had come out and they showed him what an amazing building. In Mark it says, they go and say, Lord, look at this building, look at what manner of stones it's made of. And in Luke it says that it was adorned with goodly stones. Why do you think they said that to Jesus? Do you think he missed the building on the way in? Goes into this magnificent temple, and on the way out the disciples say to him, Lord, look how amazing this building is. Do you think he missed it the first time? Why do you think he said that? I want to give you the answer, and I'm going to read to you from the Word. You'll find the answer in the Gospel of John. Gospel of John doesn't record what the other three do about Jesus' statement, but it gives us the reason why. In the Gospel of John chapter 2, I'm going to start in verse 18. Then answered the Jews and said unto him, what sign show you unto us, seeing that you do these things? Jesus answered and said unto them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Then said the Jews, 46 years was this temple in building, and you're going to build it in 3 days? John writing later, when John wrote his gospel, he had understanding. At the time he didn't have understanding, but he wrote later, but he spake of the temple of his body. When therefore he was risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this unto them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. Do you understand why they said to Jesus when he came out, Lord, look how big this building is. Have you seen how big these stones are? You've just told these guys you're going to knock the building down and in 3 days you're going to build it on your own. They were perplexed because they could not understand why Jesus would say something like that. That would remove all his credibility, don't you believe? If I was to say that, just bowl the cathedral and the cathedral square down, and Pete and I, we're going to build it in 3 days. What would you say if I said that? Or I'm going to build it on my own. You'd think the man's a lunatic. That's what the disciples are saying. Lord, look at this building. You've just said you're going to... He didn't describe to them what he was talking about. He didn't quantify. But on the Mount of Olives, he gave them an answer. And our programs today, we're going to look at the 2 answers he gave. When he was speaking to his disciples, they asked him the question, when will these things be? When's this going to happen? And Jesus gave predictions. First program, we're going to look at the predictions concerning Jerusalem, the temple itself, and the Jewish nation. Jesus didn't explain that he wasn't talking about the temple of that temple, but the temple of his body. He was going to leave that for the time and the events of the future to clarify that for them. But he just said to them, these things are going to be affected. Jerusalem, the temple, and your people, the Jewish people. He says, these are amazing statements. He says, Jerusalem is to be surrounded by an embankment or a wall and destroyed. We read that. Now as he drew near, he saw the city and wept over it, saying, the days will come upon you when your enemies will build a what? Jesus said they're going to build an embankment around you, surround you and close you in on every side, and level you and your children within you to the ground. That's in the Gospel of Luke. He said the temple was to be totally destroyed. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings. But you were not willing. See, your house, the temple, is left to you desolate, totally destroyed. And of course, he said there was not one stone. He didn't just say it was going to be destroyed partially or 90%. He said there's not going to be one stone left sitting upon another. That's a risky prophecy to make if you're just guessing, isn't it? That's an amazing fulfillment. The size of some of these stones, I've seen them, the retaining wall stones, some of them are 20 metres by 2 metres by 3 metres. The Western Wall, you're familiar with where the Jews go and wail at the Wailing Wall? Has anybody seen pictures of that? That is part of the retaining wall that was built by Herod. That Western Wall continues under the modern city. And so there's Islamic people living above the area of the Western Wall where it disappears into the hillside. So what they've done, because they can't remove those houses without creating World War III, they've tunnelled underneath. And so I've walked in that tunnel, and you can go along the Western Wall underground, and it's like a mine shaft. The biggest stone they've found so far weighs 55 tonne. Jesus said those stones are going to be cast down. He says the Jews are to fall by the sword. He says there will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will fall by the sword. Luke 21:24. As Jesus walked down the Via Dolorosa, I find it interesting today that people worship the site. When you go to the Via Dolorosa, there's people kissing the ground. Tour guide, I heard him over saying, he was speaking to some of the people in his group. He said, yeah, it's a bit silly this, because where Jesus walked is 6 metres down. But this place there, people worship the place. But when Jesus was walking down 6 metres below this point, he was fatigued and falling under the weight of the cross. We read, a great multitude of the people followed him, and women also mourned and lamented him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For indeed the days are coming in which they will say, blessed are the barren wombs that never bear, and the breasts which never nursed. And he continued to say, for if they do this thing in a green tree, what will they do in the dry? He was giving a warning of the horrible things that were about to happen to Jerusalem and the people. He says the Jews were to be scattered among the nations. I'm sure if I was one of the Jews listening to this, which part of this is good news? You can see why they rejected him. He says they will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. He said that Gentiles, that's non-Jews, it's most of us, are non-Jews. They were going to inhabit Jerusalem. That city would become their city. Here we read it in Luke 21. And Jerusalem will be trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Big prophecies we're seeing that Jesus is making. He's putting himself on a limb, don't you think? These are specific prophecies. Not like going to one of those crystal ball gazers and say, oh, sometime this year you're going to meet a special man or a special woman. That's probably likely for most young people. But these are specific prophecies. I want to see now, were they fulfilled? Did Jesus get it right? Well, in the year 66, that's 35 years later, Gessius Florus, he was the commander of the garrison looking after Jerusalem, and he put a tax on the temple. The Jews rebelled against it, and they killed everybody in the garrison. And some of the zealots, they were called, once they got one victory over the Romans, they went down to Masada, this palace fortress. And they easily overran the Romans that were caring for the palace, for the fortress. The Romans didn't like this. They didn't take this sitting down, so they sent Cestus Gallus. They sent him to quell the uprising. He surrounded Jerusalem with his army of 30,000 trained warriors. And for some reason, some unbeknown reason, he withdrew to the seacoast. The Jews, feeling that God was on their side, opened the gates of the city, fled out after Cestius Gallus, and destroyed a great proportion of his army. And they thought it was a great victory. But Jesus had given a warning instruction. When you shall see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the country regions go into it. Jesus had given a warning, and he said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, it's time to leave, because its desolation is nigh. How do you flee a city when it's surrounded? You can't. But when Cestius Gallus withdrew, the people who believed Jesus' words, we might call them Christians, those that believed the teachings of Christ among the Jews, they withdrew, they fled, they took the opportunity to escape. And they went to this little place here, this is the ruins of it, Pella. They went to Pella. And they survived because the Romans came back under a man by the name of Vespasian. And Vespasian was a ruthless warrior. He was heir apparent, or one of the heirs apparent. And Vespasian was attacking the city, and suddenly he had to leave, but he left his soldiers there under his son Titus. Vespasian had to go back because Nero passed away. And in those days, if you wanted to be the next Caesar, it was good to be on hand and do the politics and fight the little wars that you had to. And Vespasian became the next Caesar of Rome. But his son Titus besieged Jerusalem. He starved the Jews. He put a barricade around the city so they could get nothing in and nobody could come out. And the people ran out of food. They were starving. And you won't believe what he did, friends. He built a 5-mile earthen rampart, a wall around Jerusalem. Have you heard that? Did somebody say that they were going to build an embankment around the city? Tick one to Jesus' prophecies, don't you think? How would he know that? Flavius Josephus tells us that in the conflict, 1 million Jews perished. Vespasian had an amazing strategy. What he did, as he came and attacked Judea, he would attack the towns and the cities and the villages, but always leave a way of escape. And that way of escape was always towards Jerusalem. And as the people fled, they would flee to Jerusalem. He'd take over the next town and they'd flee to Jerusalem. He was corralling the Jews into one place for the final solution. Flavius Josephus tells us that 1 million of them perished in that siege. But every single person that believed Jesus' words and heeded the warning to get out survived in Pella. Not one person died at Pella. Terrible slaughter of the Jews. Flavius tells us that the blood in the final battle was running down the steps above the ankles of the Roman soldiers. Terrible bloodshed. But the Jews have suffered terribly since then. In fact, in Auschwitz, 1 million Jews have perished just in that one concentration camp during the Second World War after the Nazi occupation. The Jews have suffered through the ages. The Jews made a last stand. In the corner of the temple complex there, you can see the fortress of Antonia. That was built by the Romans because the Romans believed if there was going to be an uprising from these pesky Jews, it was going to happen in the temple complex because that was the symbol of their pride and their nationhood. And so the Romans built that complex. When they destroyed Cestius Gallus and his men, the Jews took that over. And when the Romans finally took back Antonia from the Jews, the battle moved into the temple. Titus told his men not to damage the temple because that was the crowning jewel in the Roman Empire. For them, that was their number one prize. But in the middle of the battle, nobody knows how, but maybe one of the frustrated soldiers who got sick of the Jews coming out every night and guerrilla tactics and killing some of their soldiers while they slept, had enough of them, and a torch got thrown through the window of the temple. The curtains caught ablaze, those cedar timbers caught ablaze, and the building just turned into a giant conflagration. The building was full of gold and silver. The heat of the fire was such that the gold and the silver melted and ran down into the cracks of those giant stones. Some days later, when the stones cooled down enough, the Romans went in and they removed every stone off another. What an amazing fulfillment of prophecy. They rolled every stone off another. Archaeologists have discovered some of the stones that were rolled off the temple complex to the bottom, just at the bottom of the wall today. I've seen those stones. They were covered with dirt until quite recently till archaeologists excavated them. And today the temple complex is open as a flat piece of ground, and it's occupied by the Dome of the Rock and the Alaska Mosque. If we go to the Arch of Titus in the Roman Forum in Rome, you will notice on the inside this arch there that there's a relief of Roman soldiers. And what is it that they're carrying? The 7-branched candlestick from Herod's temple, talking about his conquest of the Jews. There's no Jewish temple there today, friends. Let's move down to Masada. This is a really sad tale because there was 900 zealots that had taken up residence in Masada. It was an almost impregnable fortress. The Romans had built it well, never expecting that they might have to one day try and conquer it. And so what they did, to this very day, you can see the encircling wall and the Roman camps where they set up camp and they besieged it. Flavius Silva, the commander, he got thousands of slaves and they built a siege ramp, carried immense amounts of dirt and made this huge ramp up to the top of the hill. As they went up, they had catapults, and these are some of their cannonballs, if you like. These are their siege missiles that they would catapult into the city. You do not want to get hit by one of them. It could result in quite a nasty wound or a serious bruise, I would imagine. But these were flying through the air and crashing through the buildings and clearly killing some of the occupants. They eventually broke through this wall. And as they broke through the wall, it was nighttime, and they knew that going in there to fight at nighttime in unfamiliar territory was not a wise move. So they withdrew and left some guards stationed on the rampart so that the Jews couldn't escape. And the Jews knew that tomorrow it was all over for them. We know what happens next because there was one girl that hid herself and she survived and she was able to tell the story. In this very synagogue, the head of the zealots, Eleazar ben Yair was his name. He gave a rousing speech and he encouraged the people, rather than to allow their woman to fall into the hands of the Romans to be abused, and rather than being tortured and murdered by the Romans, they should take their own lives. And they made a suicide pact. And in this very room, one of the most famous Israeli archaeologists, named by the name of Yigael Yadin, he discovered these 10 little pottery shards with names on. In English they're lots, in Hebrew they're called oskata. They believe these are the names of the 10 men who drew the lots, who had to finally kill the rest of the Jews. And in the morning when the Romans arrived, they found not a living soul up there apart from this one little girl who came out from her hiding place. Today, every Israeli infantryman, every Israeli member of the Air Force swears their allegiance on the top of this hill and they say, never again. Emperor Hadrian drove the Jews from Jerusalem because there was another uprising. Following this, it was called the Bar Kokhba uprising in 135 AD. And he just banished the Jews to every part of the world. And today the Jews are scattered around the world. What did Jesus say? You'll be scattered in all nations of the world. In fact, there's more Jews today living in New York and in Moscow and in London than there are in Israel. What about Jerusalem then? Who occupies Jerusalem? Gentiles. Non-Jews inhabit Jerusalem. The greater part of Jerusalem is occupied by non-Jews, even though Israel's taken the land over today. Palestinian Arabs control the Temple Mount. I want to ask you, friends, what about Christ's predictions? Did he get lucky? Or did he know something? Did he have some insight? This is supernatural to make so many specific predictions, don't you believe? And yet have those predictions all come true. What would be the verdict if you were passing judgment on that? Clearly this is supernatural. This is divine, don't you believe? Same connection that Daniel had. And so his predictions, like Daniel's, were exactly fulfilled. 540 BC, Christ's predictions were anchored in some predictions of Daniel in 540 BC. And in the book of Luke, we read this. Therefore, Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, spoken of by who? Spoken of by? The prophet Daniel. So Jesus is acknowledging one of Daniel's prophecies written 500 years before. He said, when you see that standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Matthew 24. Luke 21 says that, using the same text, says that's when you see Jerusalem surrounded with armies. And the people that followed the prophecy of Daniel and repeated by Jesus survived. The prophecies of Daniel were powerful. Jesus accepted them. And one of those prophecies was to do with interesting animals. Daniel chapter 8, this time it's Daniel having a vision. It's by the banks of the river Ulai. And he has this vision of these two interesting animals. A great war between a ram and a goat. I'm not going to go into the prophecy in detail. Following this series of programs, we will make available to you a study on these early chapters of Daniel, so you will be able to see what really took place here. We're going to see some amazing prophecies and some amazing fulfillments and some amazing relevance for us today. But there's this great war between the ram and the goat. Who's the ram and the goat? What do they represent? Who are they? Well, in Daniel 8 verse 20 it tells me, the ram which you saw having the two horns, they are Russia and Iran. Is that what it says, friends? I said last night that people say there's so many ways to interpret these prophecies. I say nay. Because they're very specific, aren't they? We saw last night Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, "You are the head of gold." There's no other way to interpret that. I can't see any other way of interpreting this than that the two horns that you saw on the ram are the kings of Media and Persia. So what about the goat? The male goat is the kingdom of... I know some people that talk about these things, you have a little blank space there, put in what suits you best. It's the one world banking system. It's the World Monetary Fund. It's Osama bin Laden. It's Henry Kissinger. It's Donald Trump. People want to apply these prophecies. It's so clear, isn't it? It's the king of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Who's that first king? The goat is Greece. Who was the first king of Greece that brought Greece, united the city-states and led them on a global conquest? What was his name? His name was Alexander the Great, the first king. It was Alexander the Great. Do you know this was written long before he was born? Centuries before he was born. This was written when Greece was a lot of isolated city-states at war with one another. How do you think Alexander felt when he met the Jews and was shown the prophecy of Daniel that spoke about him centuries before he was born? Do you have an inkling that he may have felt a wee bit like Cyrus? That somebody knew about him before he was born? But an amazing thing happened. And here's where I'm going to just share with you one of these mysteries from history. Historians struggle to explain why he did not destroy Jerusalem when they were sided with the Persians. And I gave you the backstory earlier on. And I'll just repeat it. It's worthy of repetition. Just make sure that you've caught it. The Jews only had their city, their temple, and their nation because of the Persians, the benevolence of the Persians. Are you tracking with me? Cyrus saw his name written in Scripture, and so he just said, if you have a Bible and you look at the first 2 verses of the book of Ezra and the last 2 verses of the book of 2 Chronicles, they coincide with one another. You read the 2 verses and then you read them repeated in the second verse, where Cyrus says, "The God of heaven has appointed me to build him a temple in Jerusalem." He understood that God had done it for him. Alexander the Great has got no knowledge of this. He's coming to destroy the city of Jerusalem. And for the Jews, it would have been a wee bit late if he'd have slaughtered them all and then found a copy of their scriptures that talked about him. So God brought a miracle. In the city, as Alexander's forces are on the outside, the chief priest, a man by the name of Jaddua, had a dream. And in his dream, he was instructed what to do about this invading force. He was told to put on all of the priestly garb, the Urim and the Thummim, the stones, the ephod, to get dressed in his priestly regalia that he used to do the service in the sanctuary, and then go and face the army. How would you feel if that was you? I think I'd be looking around going, does anybody want to volunteer to be the chief priest today? He was told to dress in his priestly garb and go and face the most powerful man and the most powerful army on the planet, who had bloodlust in their hearts and conquest in their minds. How would you feel going out there to face him just dressed, not in armour, but in linen? Linen's not the best thing for stopping sword blows or javelins flying through the air. But that's what Jaddua was told to do. And he lined up the other priests. And in the morning, as the army is lined up outside of the city of Jerusalem, the gates opened. The Greeks prepared for battle. And they noticed this man dressed up in a glorified baker's uniform with some stones all over the front of him and a crazy hat on his head comes walking out to meet him. And behind him there's a whole lot of other men dressed in white linen. His general said it's a trap and they're preparing to attack. Alexander the Great stayed his army. He got down, as the picture depicts, he got off his horse And he walked up to the priest Jaddua, and he fell to his knees and worshipped him. And his men are dismayed. What is going on? What's happened to Alexander the Great? We've never seen him do that in his life. He gave obeisance to nobody, but he gave obeisance to God's priest. Why did he do that, friends? Because God had sent him a dream the night before as well. And Alexander the Great, in his dream, had seen a man dressed in garb that you couldn't even begin to imagine coming out before him. And in his dream, he didn't know it was God, but the power in his dream told him, "You do not touch that man. He is my servant." Alexander the Great told his men to leave the Jews alone, and this is Raphael's picture, famous medieval picture of Alexander the Great worshipping in the temple in Jerusalem. And it was there that he was shown the prophecy that identified him as a coming reigning power. And in the prophecy, it said he would conquer Medo-Persia. Was that good news for Alexander the Great? Absolutely. Would you like to hear a prophecy like that? Everybody else gets prophecies about how they're going to get destroyed. Alexander the Great gets told by the one that's given him this dream, this impossible dream that's fulfilled the following morning. He's told by him that he is going to conquer the Medes and the Persians. And Alexander the Great, instead of destroying Jerusalem, protects Jerusalem. God protects his people. Amazing story, isn't it? But the prophecy goes on, "Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. As for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation." What's the nation, friends? It's Greece. We're talking about Greece, aren't we? It says 4 are going to rise out of it, but not with its power. Alexander the Great, at the age of 32, 33, got alcohol poisoning from his lascivious lifestyle, and he died in Babylon. He had no heir, had no son, and they said, "Who's to take over?" As he was in his on his sick bed, they said, "Who's going to take over if you die?" And he said, "Let them fight for it. Let them fight for it." His empire died with him, and they fought. And 4, not 3, friends, not 5. How many? 4. Daniel had predicted centuries before that it would be divided into 4. And 4 generals, Ptolemy, Cassander, Lysimachus, and Seleucus, divided the Greek Empire up. Ptolemy took North Africa, and the last member of the Ptolemy lineage was a lady by the name of Cleopatra in the time of the Romans. Seleucus took the area of Syria, and the Lysimachus and Cassander, they took the northern parts of Turkey and Greece as we know it today. What an amazing fulfillment of prophecy. 4 notable ones, horns come up toward the 4 winds of heaven, and out of one of them, one of the 4 winds, one of the 4 points of the compass, came a little horn, which grew exceeding great towards the south, toward the east, and toward the glorious land. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. He shall also stand up against the prince of princes. So here we have Medo-Persia, then we have Greece, then we have Greece divided into 4, and then there's a little horn rises up. We're going to talk about this little horn briefly now, but we're going to study that in more detail later with a bit more clarity. But just initially, primarily, who does the little horn represent? Represents Rome. Rome came along. Rome came from the west. What were the actions of the little horn? It went south. Well, everybody knows about Mark Antony and Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. It went east to Mesopotamia. It went to Israel, the glorious land. In fact, Pompey, he conquered Israel. He took over Israel in 63 BC. It was greater than Greece, exceeding great. It stands against Jesus Christ. And we know that it was the Roman soldiers that put Christ to death. He was tried in a Roman court. He was whipped by Roman whips. It cast down the sanctuary, the temple, to the ground. And we know that in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the temple. It took away the daily temple services. Well, when the temple's destroyed, you can't have the temple services, can you? And it trampled on God's people. And some of the most horrific acts in history happened in the early days of Christianity when Rome persecuted people. In great auditoriums like the Colosseum, Christians were fed to wild animals. They were used as sword bait, as gladiators just executed them for people to watch and get pleasure from, much like mainstream television today. They were covered with tar and set on fire. They persecuted God's people. We are going to look at a more poignant and relevant application of what the little horn means for you and I today later. But it was not good news for the people in the early days of Christianity, would you agree? What are the essentials for knowing the future? Remember, historical accuracy. What we've shared, has it been historically accurate? Does the Bible have a proven track record and dependable predictions? Were Jesus' predictions fulfilled? Yes? Absolutely. Absolutely. Is there such a source? Absolutely there is. So we've got a most reliable source for knowing the future, and that's this book here, friends. The prophecies weren't just to tell Alexander the Great how great he was. It wasn't just to give Cyrus some instructions on the building code for Jerusalem. These were given for us, that we might know. Christ's predictions were exactly fulfilled. Christ gave other predictions, friends. Outside of Jerusalem 2,000 years ago on the Mount of Olives, speaking to his disciples, he gave predictions concerning Jerusalem, the temple, and the Jewish nation. Not one of those specific prophecies has failed. They've all been fulfilled. But he also gave some predictions concerning our time. Predictions that are relevant for us living in 2018. Would you like to know what those predictions are? Well, in our next session, part 2, we're going to go to Pompeii, and we're going to see what Jesus said for you and I living today. So we've just witnessed the two terrible tragedies of both Masada and Jerusalem. In the next program, we're going to look at another tragedy that need not have happened, as we take you to Italy, to the ancient city of Pompeii, and see how people who rejected a very clear warning suffered a total annihilation. Don't miss the next program, called How Near Is the End, to learn a valuable lesson that we don't miss the warning signs.